Hi, Misha here, and in an effort to do more CNR videos, people seem to kind of like the Remington 1891 Mosin we posted. Fun story, when I had posted that on Gunbroker after the video or whatever, and whatnot, just to move it along, I had marked it not thinking Remington 1917, because that's what it was dated. And it didn't occur to me till later that could have been, at a glance, mistooken. That's the word, tooken. It's staying in. I got to do Fox's job. For a U.S. Enfield model 1917. And someone very politely said, I think you uploaded the wrong pictures. It's a Mosin, not an Enfield. And then later he's like, never mind. He read the description, and we had a good laugh. I just wanted to share that story because it didn't cross my mind until after I did it that, yeah, that might kind of, people didn't know they made one. Well, today we're going to talk about a gun that pretty much everyone knows was made. And really the last standard issue, fully adopted member in the Mosin family, the M44 Carbine. So we'll talk about it a bit, revisit it. And really kind of the reason behind is because recently nephew was gifted a Russian Mosin, not dissimilar to this one, by his father, a veteran. And we ran out and ran a couple of 5-shot mags through it, just for fun. It's always fun to shoot a Mosin on a pretty day. So we'll cut over to that. Then we'll talk about our variants here, history. We have a Russian 1944, so World War II era. We have a Polish, Circle 11, 1953. And then finally, we have a Hungarian 02 marked for FAG, also 1953. And I'll also explain why these are the three Mosins, or the three variants of the M44 rather, that I decided to keep over the years. But yeah, let's first show, frankly, nephew operating a M44 like a boss at the range.
Oh. Okay.
You're the first person to use a Mosin safety and for any real application in years.
Yeah. Oh, rip my shoulder. Okay. Jesus. Woo! There's something about them. You'll learn to love them.
Learn to love them.
Yeah.
Like I'm 12. I was shooting these before you were born.
Yeah.
Remember that.
Yeah, but here, I want to point this out. He shot that a lot better than you did.
You and your slings too.
I actually did not put that one on.
I cannot get it to run back. Yeah, his isn't gummed up, think. Sticky bolt again.
Had to harass Fox a little bit there. Also, hey, if that's the stuff we do put on YouTube, just imagine the outtakes. Though the history of the carbine in Russia actually had a very slow start. And the gun that Fox was shooting was a Remington-made version of an 1891, the original pattern. Although this is the revised version introduced around 1910 to fire the Spitzer variant and 7.62 54R cartridge. They went to the slot sling swivels. They had added an upper handguard, initially didn't have it, and made a few other quality of life changes. The original long rifle was truly long, about 51.5 inches overall, with a 31.5 barrel, and depending on the exact variant, weighing in somewhere around or over 9 pounds. And you might think, adopted in the 1890s, there would be a carbine. There was not. The powers that be in Russia felt that a carbine was not necessary. However, around 1894-95, they did adopt two somewhat shorter specialized variants, the Cossack and the Dragoon. Now here is the 9130, but it started off life as a Dragoon. Now, they were very, very similar, the Cossack and the Dragoon. They had barrels right at or just under 29 inches, so 2.5 inches, give or take, shorter. And they were actually the first to use the slots for slings. Originally, the rifle had swivels. Well, the Cossack Dragoon had slots, something that would be carried over to all guns by the time of World War I. And the difference between the two, the Dragoon could take a bayonet, the Cossack could not. The Cossacks were basically horse cavalry. The Dragoons were expected to ride into battle on horses, but then dismount and fight as standard infantry. So the end of the barrel was a little bit different, but that was really it. And that was kind of the shortest version they had during the Russo-Japanese War. But that's when they realized we really need a carbine. So in 1907, the Tsar directly ordered, "Make me a carbine." And by 1910, he had it. This would be the quite rare today model of 1907 carbine, but it actually does directly relate proportionally to World War II carbines, because it too had a barrel roughly 20 inches, but of course it was on the 91 pattern. And it would actually be the lightest Mosin variant at under 7.5 pounds. Today, though, they're exceedingly rare. They never made them in huge numbers between 1910 and 1917, under 350,000, which sounds a lot, but so many were lost in World War I and were converted into other guns later and given away that you just don't run across them today. And of course, with the Bolsheviks coming in, there would be a lot of changes into the 1920s. Cossack production ended with World War I, and then there would be no production for a couple of years. But around 1922, the Soviet commission in charge decided to restart Mosin production at Izhevsk and Tula, and they were going to discontinue the infantry variant and only produce the somewhat shorter Dragoon. It was also decided to set up studies to find ways to improve. Faster production, more modern methods, yada yada yada. This would begin in 1924 and ultimately result in the 9130 variant we know and love today, although full transition over would not happen until 1935, 1936. So it was a long process. In the interim, they were making Dragoons. Again, no carbines. But it is worth pointing out what changed because they would be carried over to carbines. The biggest one, they went from they changed the interrupter for feeding. Joking aside, one of the issues with the original 91 was feeding, and they resolved that to some extent with the 9130 pattern. They would also introduce a new pattern of rear sight, and it's graduated in standard meters instead of the old Artians. That would come in 31. Around 33, you would get the new pattern of front sight. It's protected. It's also just a simple post. And this would require an update to the kind of socket-style bayonet. The barrel bands and retention would also get updated. And then finally, the receiver would go from the hex style to the round between 1935 and 1936. Those are just kind of some basic overruns. So, it wasn't just that this was lighter and shorter. The 9130 overall length is about 48.5. Barrel, like I said, since it's based on the Dragoon, is just right at about 29. And the weight does drop to around 8.75 pounds, depending on the exact stock construction, type of wood, that kind of thing. So that was what was in production. But then the idea of revisiting a carbine came out. Something as a secondary weapon, shorter, lighter, handier, just to sling across your shoulder, was needed for mechanized troops, drivers of some things, artillery, signal corps, messengers of other types, reconnaissance, just something when they need their hands free. Slinging a 9130 across your shoulder, especially with the bayonet it used, which we will talk about in a minute, wasn't really practical. So in 1938, this pattern was created, and it was adopted the following year. The M38, as I've said before, is kind of one of my favorites. And it returns to the 20-inch barrel, first tried out on the 07 Carbine. It does have a shortened handguard, but otherwise is pretty much a 9130, just with a shorter barrel. Overall length is just a hair under 40 inches. And the weight, it's not bad. About 7.5 to 7.75 pounds, depending on stock construction and type. And these would be primarily produced at Mishaco between 1939 and 1945, although Tula would make one run in 1940 and another run in 1944. But these were never meant for frontline use all the time for everyone. They were meant for specialists. Nevertheless, they did turn out nearly 2.5 million, so far more than the 07. But the Great Patriotic War, World War II, changed a lot of minds. And that gets us to today's topic, the model of 1944, even though the first ones were actually made in 1943 as a test run. With experience with submachine guns and other things, they saw that there were very few downsides to a carbine and many upsides. But the powers that be weren't just happy with taking the M38. No, if they're going to make a standard issue, general issue carbine, it needs a bayonet. The reasons were given as, urban warfare, close quarters, what have you. So that's the primary difference. Installing a bayonet housing. So Mishaco would do a trial run of about 50,000 in 1943. And with good reception, it would be put into full production and officially adopted as the 9130's replacement the following year. And production would ramp up quite good. One thing I do want to mention, the bayonets. Both the 91 and the 9130 had this style of socket bayonet. Now, it was a different pattern for the different front sight, but it does just socket on to the end. The idea was pretty much people would have these bayonets affixed unless they were being transported or otherwise they weren't really needing or safe to have. And yes, a lot of canvas tops were punctured by these. If you were to put its bayonet on, this gun has an overall length from butt plate to the tip of the pig sticker of 68 inches. Please consider that. Nigh on 6 foot. The 9130, it's about 65 inches. And the M44, you can tell that its bayonet is very much inspired by this. But they wanted something that could more easily be deployed and retracted. Nevertheless, with it out, it has a reach of almost 51 inches. So still well over 4 foot. Not bad. So if we're really breaking things down, the difference between an M44 and an M38, the bayonet. Now there are some little differences, but that's the big deal. The M38 was meant to be a carbine. In fact, its barrel was technically too short to mount an M9130 spike bayonet. But when they decided to adopt the pattern as general issue, that was the one thing it needed to have, was a bayonet. So they actually extended the barrel out about 1/2 inch. And they went to this permanently affixed side folding pig sticker. Fixed bayonets were kind of coming into vogue at this time. Look at the SKS. Sorry, a little hard to do on camera, guys. But it actually needed that little bit longer barrel to lock on. Right here. It will just snap on if you push it, but yeah. So, so the barrel barely sticks out, enough room. And that's what was needed to make this acceptable for the Russians as a standard issue. The stock had to be slightly modified, the pattern. You see the cutout here for the bayonet to fold into. And you'll often find M38s in M44 stocks. That's fine. During the refurb process, they didn't really make a distinction. I've even seen some M38 stocks hastily modified to take an M44 bayonet. But when someone says that, that's what they made. Just down in there like that. Overall, the M44 does feel just a little bit beefier, a little bit thicker stock. But I don't know if that's reality or just kind of perception. But yeah, that's kind of the big main difference. Slightly longer barrel and a bayonet assembly, which definitely does bump the weight up noticeably. But not in a bad way, because it's out towards the muzzle. It does kind of help check recoil. You still get the giant fireball, but these do have a little less thump to them than an M38. I think they're cool. What do you think? You own one? One thing I wanted to point out, Mosins at the factory were sighted in with their bayonets attached, and the bayonets were serialed to the guns. Here's that M38 again. Even if you wanted to put the bayonet on the 38, even if you didn't mind the barrel being too short, the band that holds the front sight on won't let this bayonet slide over it. Of course, here this is deployed. Even with M44s, they were sighted in with the bayonet out. So even at this time, and I'm sure many soldiers did keep these folded a lot of the times, the idea was in the field, this was out. Because with the bolt action, you never know, when you might need to go close quarters. Early on in the video, we did have some fun at Fox's expense, and he's a good sport about it. But yeah, the one he shot was old, and really hadn't cleaned it. And the 91s do tend to be a little more finicky than the 9130s, especially, modern ammo and an old gun. So here's a little bit of redemption for Fox.
Sure. Okay, fine. Then you have to shoot his now.
Oh, I'm going to.
Which granted, that took me like 3 hours to clean. So there's a huge, the whole story about
Oh, I didn't clean the one I handed him. It was
No.
It was 120 years old, just completely filthy. I gotta fuck with him somehow.
Well, yeah. All right, hand me 3. or
3?
4.
Oh, no. 4.
Yeah,
4.
He did 4. You gotta do 4.
Of course.
That's fair. That is completely fair.
These are my least favorite firearms on the planet.
See, you load it though. Really?
You definitely load it. Keep in mind,
I jammed my
this was
finger
the
in there.
only gun I owned at one point in time.
That's the only gun we all owned at one point in one time.
It was the only gun I owned.
I am not kidding. Me too. I had one sitting in my closet when I was in college in the apartment.
Oh, no.
I gummed my fingers.
You think
over
we could make him laugh hard enough he'd swallow one of those bullets?
That would be pretty good.
Explain that suppository to the doctor.
All right. Here we go. Everybody covering their ears. It's going hot.
Jesus Christ.
There's
just
something
feel
about
it.
shooting this gun where it feels like every time you pull the trigger, you will not be surprised if something comes out of this and jabbles yourself in the neck. Fuck this gun.
I love it. I think
I'm
it's
So, we've adopted in Russia. Let's talk about production and variants. I do want to mention that the man mostly tasked with making this new housing was known as Seaman. I just could not say that with J-Ro filming me in front of the camera because he is a child. Anyone who saw the Steyr Mannlicher video knows exactly what I'm coming from. So here we are. But that was the designer of this, and I thought I would mention it. And these were primarily produced at Izhevsk. There was a run at Tula in 1944, but only about 100,000 were built. The thing is, in 1944, Tula was moving back to its original location, so its production was disrupted, leaving Izhevsk to make these. As we already said, 50,000 in 1943. 1944 would be the most produced year, meaning technically mine here is the most common year. with over 3,600,000 built. So yeah, they went in on a big way. Then again, the only real difference is they extended the barrel slightly and added an assembly to the M38, so they were tooled up for it. 1945, they would make almost 3,500,000, so nearly as much. Those were the two big years and would be the bulk of M44 production within Russia. It would continue on after the war, though. In 1946, they would build just under 190,000. And 1947 would be the second most rare year after 43, with only about 120,000 built. And then in 1948, frankly, they were just using up parts and wrapping things up, and they would build a little over 160,500 of these. Total, over 7,711,000 were built in Russia, meaning a lot. Maybe not as many as the M9130, but a significant fraction of the over 37 million Mosin-Nagant types estimated to have been produced over the years. But of course, there would be some changes and updates and differences too. Stocks. These would be made of birch. They would either be hardwood or laminate. And you can tell because the laminate has the extra reinforcement at the wrist here versus hardwood. I left my M38 out because the earliest ones made 43, 44, and into 45 were like this. You had the simple liner here for the front slot. You have to have something, otherwise the wood's too thin. And in the rear, it was just a hole. No escutcheon at all. But in 1945, they would go to these pressed-in escutcheons. Some earlier ones, like on the 9130, could be riveted, screwed in. But at the end of World War II, they went to a simplified pressed-in version. This would appear at the end of the war. It would also appear on post-war guns and wartime guns that were sent in for replacement. The laminate stocks, a few were used in World War II, but often you will see these added post-wars where they just use whatever. The benefit of laminate, it a little stronger, and you can use more types of pieces of wood together. The kind of downside, you got to press it together. Also, it weighs a little more. With the hardwood, this is about 8.9 pounds. With the laminate, it's about 9.1. So, yeah, this one is noticeably heavier. Another difference, the receiver, high wall, and high wall for the M44, so they carry that over, but this would be changed later. Of course, they have the carbine rear sights. One thing I would like to point out, the bore diameters. These are still, of course, 7.62 54R, but it seems like the M44s have slightly wider bores. Anyone who does reloading, who slugs a barrel, this is around, 310, 311. Some M44s go to 312, even 313. Not enough to matter, really, but probably just to make them a little more flexible on ammo type and cleaning, because, again, this was for a general issue. I just thought I would point that out, because I find it kind of fascinating. Well, let's continue on. There were two basic variants of the M44 made within the Soviet Union, plus lots of transitional. Yeah, the Russians like transitioning. Don't tell Putin. And a lot of times, too, guns sent in for refurbishment would get a mixed match of parts. So, yeah, take it as you will. I'm going to use my Polish here as an example since I don't have a gun. They would switch over in 1945, so basically after World War II, after these had been in the field. Not a whole lot of M44s made it to the front line, but some did. And aside from going to the low wall receiver again, the main changes were all to do with the bayonet housing. They basically just refined it, revised it a wee bit. They went to a wide front sight base from the original narrow. They also went from the kind of straight loop to the recessed one here. That was to actually let it fold over easier. And one that's often not noticeable at first, they added these teeth in the front. Notice this one doesn't have any here, and this does. And that was for more secure locking. Here the bayonets are deployed, and indeed, I can confirm the second pattern is easier to do. Now it does have these teeth in the back from the beginning to lock it folded, and they're retained for the second pattern, but they're added in the front just for a little more reinforcement. You can hear a little bit of wiggle there. With this, the wiggles even diminish. It's just a little bit more connection, makes things line up a little easier, a little less flex. You can understand why they did it. So yeah, those are the big differences. Stock, receiver, and the bayonet housing. And then most nations that would produce the M44 would copy the second pattern, very analogous to what happened with the Tokarev pistol. But anyway, that's Russia for yous. By the time it was adopted, the M44 was already obsolete in Russia, and so it was given over post-war to second-line troops, parades, guards, reservists, that kind of thing, because already they've been working on much newer, better things. Within Russia, the 7.6 to 54R caliber M44 was always a wartime interim solution, because going all the way back to 1942 into 43, a new program was started around a new cartridge, 7.62 by 39, although originally it was actually 7.62 by 41. The point was getting rid of the old-fashioned rimmed round, going not just to a recessed rimmed, but intermediate cartridge was the deal. And that brought with it new guns. There would be the RPD light machine gun. For the carbine role, we would have the SKS, of course. And replacing the submachine gun, we would have the Kalashnikov, the so-called AK-47, although it was just called the AK in Russia. The idea of an assault rifle was still forming at this time. And initially, the Mosin was going to be taken for the ride. There were going to be 4 in the family, including a bolt-action, chambered for 7.62 by 39, based on the M44. And back when these were cheap, I always said I would like to get one and re-chamber it to fire X39, but I never did. Anyway, neither did Russia. After putting other guns into production, they realized that the bolt-action was the past. So it wasn't worth their effort. In fact, even its replacement, the SKS, would prove to be short-lived in frontline Russian service because, well, by the 1950s, the Kalashnikov was clearly the future. But, whereas the M44 had a brief time inside Russia, in satellite nations and Warsaw Pact member nations, it was very popular and would continue to see frontline use all the way through the 60s and beyond. So let's break into those. Alrighty. So these are the 3 over the years that I've kept. And there are other variants and types. You'll notice there's not a Romanian here. And Romania made some really nice ones. There's also not a Chinese. I don't know. Just not that I have a problem with them. They're cool, but these are the ones that just kind of spoke to me. The Russian, obviously, I would want a Soviet-produced version. And it's really nice to have a World War II. There are a few 1943s. But really 44 is the first year of note to find, and you can find some 45s. But this one was a pretty solid example. It has the reinforcing bolt in the stock because it's the wartime style stock. This one does have the sling escutcheons. Cleaning rod, of course our bayonet. And there are some variations you can find on these in places like the lug up here and how it's machined out. Kind of interesting. Also note that this isn't machined down here on the receiver wall. So yeah, the Russian guns have some unique features. The Polish guns, these are just maybe the nicest made. Hardwood, very distinctive. Notice there's no metal escutcheon in the back, and in the front you only have like the bottom style. This is also machined differently up here for the lug system, and it has the wide base. And this has the lightning cut on the receiver wall, but actually this style of cut was only done by the Circle 11, the Luxnick factory. The other ones could have them, but it was just kind of unique to them, the way they cut it. And their bluing was gorgeous. And when these guns came in, most of them were just in tip-top shape. I mean, again, made in 1953. Yeah, they were basically make work. And finally, one that initially I wasn't against it. I just was kind of like, yeah, why? Seemed like another one. The Hungarian. And in some ways, this might be rougher in the manufacturing compared to Polish or even Romanian. Maybe there's not just a smidgen. The stock is more of a, not rough, but it's got more texture to it. The machining up here, especially on the barrel, a little more lathe marking. It does have a lightning cut on the receiver. We do have a stock escutcheon here, wide base. But what's unique about the Hungarian is actually the front sling swivel. It's moved. I don't know why they did this. I think that's kind of neat. I like it when they do little changes. And again, this one came in, was in really good shape. I just kind of liked it. Own things. I'm sure you've done the same thing. Sometimes a gun just speaks to you. So I kind of planned to get a Polish and a Russian. The Hungarian was more of a snap decision. I thought it was neat. We'll move on. So back to our Polish friend. This model was known as the WZ-44 and was a copy of the late style, like we've already seen. The only real notable difference, they used a hardwood stock made of beech, and they didn't bother with putting the full escutcheons in. They kind of did their own thing. And of course, it's very high-grade bluing from Circle 11, just as you would expect, and these were done in peacetime. They would set up production in 1950, and production would run from 51 through 55. Some sources put it longer. They're incorrect. How many were built? Actually, a pretty good number. A little under 350,000 total. So, pretty large for third-party sourcing. But they're so desirable because of how attractive they are. They even made a 22 single-shot trainer version known as the WZ-48. The way Polish designating works with Soviet guns, if they're just directly copying, they give it the Soviet year. If they're doing their own variant or twist on it, they'll give it their own year. They did look at going to the SKS, even getting a trial batch in the mid-50s. And Russia really wanted them to, because Russia was making money and getting favors off, let's just put it this way, the communists weren't giving designs like this away. And even though Russia considered it obsolete, for them, they were happy for their satellite nations to pay for it, including Poland. They did for the M44, but they were able to get out of the SKS and went directly to the AK. Very high quality guns, and most that you find in the US are in great shape too. To the Hungarians, the rifle was known as the 48M, kind of their naming system, specifically the Carbine, because they would acquire, and even some sources say produce, 9130s as a rifle variant. And again, we're very close to the second Russian pattern. I do notice the machining is different here on the lug assembly a little bit, where you grasp it, but very tiny differences. And as we pointed out, the sling slot is actually moved further back. It's roughly 1 inch. It does have an escutcheon back here too. And this is also a hardwood stock made of either beech or some say elm wood, or probably they use both. And it's a true oil finish. This is shellac style from Russia. This is more of a polished, but still not shellac finish, kind of semi-gloss. This is a very matte finish, and you can really feel the grain in the wood here. And in Hungary, production was quite brief. Some sources say 52 to 53, some say 52 to 55. I don't know which is exactly correct. But they only built about 160,000, so about half of what Poland did, even less. Hungary wasn't really keen on making the M44 Mosin. They were really just happy buying what they needed from Russia. But Warsaw Pact pressure in 1948 kind of had them do it for a bit. And they too would be able to skip the SKS and go straight to the AK. So at least there was an advantage in that. Still a neat gun. And of course they wouldn't be the only nations to adopt and even produce an M44 variant. I've already mentioned Romania. The huge arsenal would build the M44 for a couple of years, 1953 through 55. And these would actually be a very small production number, about 70,000. It turns out they're quite rare. Interestingly, if you find a Romanian M44, a lot of times they'll be mismatched or even have some Russian parts on them. Other times they will be entirely Romanian, kind of, Similar to that, China. They produced it as the Type 53. Production numbers, who knows, because it's China. And they would use them frontline for the People's Liberation Army, and then go to second line. They would also give a lot of Type 53s to allies around the world, which is why they still appear in America quite regularly. Albania was a prime receiver of them. In fact, some 53s would even be built without the bayonet, kind of making them effectively M38s. And that's why I brought this version out real quick. This is the 9159, as we call it. These were actually long rifles converted to M38 carbine spec. We thought originally maybe it was done elsewhere, but more recent evidence shows it was probably done in Russia, and at least 1 million, maybe as many as 3 million were converted. They have a unique front sight. A lot of them are in M44 stocks like this one, and they have the rifle rear sight, calibre kind of marked for carbine. A lot of them are wartime receiver guns. Thought I'd mention those, and those would turn up in places even including like the Vietnam War. And another kind of project, Czechoslovakia. They never really built them, but they did do cut downs we refer to as 9138s. These were often original 91s, not 9130s, cut down. Interestingly, they'd actually had a dedicated carbine rear sight. And there'd be a few of those floating around. And finally, Yugoslavia would refurbish and rework some M44s, but never actually producing their own. They might make spare parts and there or that. Keep in mind, Russia had literally millions of these. So a lot of countries would either be given or would be kind of arm-twisted into buying them from Russia. And then what Russia couldn't fulfill, China would. So they were your two big producers of the world to the M44. And explains why so many are out there. Few nations made 9130s, but really no one made M38s except for Russia. That's kind of unique to them. So that's kind of a brief rundown of the variants, their differences, and what production information I was able to find. Let's see how it does for me. Get out of there.
I'm glad I broke it in for you.
You did. And back here, and I thought we'd end with the Polish. It's funny, when the M44 started coming into the USA, you could actually find Romanian, Hungarian, and Polish easier than you could Soviet Russian. Now, even then, the Polish were selling for more. I remember I went into a local gun shop, and they had really nice Romanian and Hungarian for about 70, 80 bucks. And the Polish, it was 110. So I bought a Romanian. Hey, 30 bucks, guys. Then, just a couple of years later, the Russians really started coming in, and then the Eastern European built ones kind of dried up. And that's where they've stayed up to this day. I always did want to get a Polish, but their prices have only risen. And I have this one thanks to a friend who gave it to me for doing some work for him a few years back. So, yeah. So I got a lot of these guns. A lot of times, you know, trade work and help for a gun. It works. But I really do like the Polish. They're very well done. But unfortunately, they just don't quite have the history, like, say, a Russian here. These were used at the tail end of World War II. And for several years after in the Red Army, until the SKS and AK were ready. And they were the last real full adoption version of the Mosin bolt action in the Red Army, and really one of the last bolt action variants to be adopted by any military at all, because, you know, semi-autos and select fires were coming into vogue. But of course, Mosins made in the millions would stick around battlefields for a long time. And of course, we see a lot of battlefield Chinese Type 53s. So they would definitely carry on into Vietnam. I just find the whole Mosin family interesting. J-Ro and I were talking off camera. They're just fun. They're dependable. For what they are, they're very accurate. You'd be surprised. And you can get ammo for them. 7.62 54R is still available. It's always good to use 149 grain if you can. Try not to get the 184 in there. It won't blow them up, but it just won't be as accurate, and you might get sticky bolt. There usually you can find one in really good shape. That's another benefit with a good bore. There's only 4 serial numbers to really worry about on a Mosin. You've got, of course, on the bolt itself, which is often upside down here. And you've got one that's technically on the barrel, but that counts as a receiver. You've got one on the magazine floor plate, which counts as the trigger group too. And then finally you have one back here, butt plate, which also counts as the stock. So kind of each serial number does double duty, counting for 2 parts. So finding a matching one isn't too difficult. Now, just a side note, when it comes to Finnish Mosins, those rules go out the window. Fin matching is a force match bolt and receiver. That's Finland. Or just not matching. Don't expect that. But that's kind of getting in. But that question comes up a lot, and I really do like Finnish Mosins too. But they're a lot of fun, and they were, for a lot of us, our first or one of our first milsurps, and rightfully so. Even today, while prices have gone up quite a bit, they're still cheaper than many of the alternatives, with the exception of maybe, say, Carcanos or what have you. But they're a lot cheaper than a 1903 or a K98, what have you. And it's easy to get one that hasn't been messed with. So I encourage it. If you haven't picked one up, and as we've mentioned, ammo is maybe harder to come by in 2023. This is a way to really stretch. I mean, 20 rounds out of a Mosin, you can stretch that out to easily half an hour of shooting. Might be something to consider. And if you do own one, share it with us in the comments. We'd love to hear which M44s you have. As always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, check out the link to Patreon. On behalf of Fox and Nephew and J-Ro and everyone else, we'll catch you very soon next time.